And again, just to uh, say how grateful we are for our director Trey for doing this session. And um, uh, if you like what you hear, we will be putting it on our YouTube channel in the next day or so. If you want to tell other people about it, that's where it'll be at. So with no further ado, if I can introduce Trey.
Hi, Antonio, and thanks for organising today. I want to share my screen. Um, da- okay, okay. Antonio, can you just let me know if you could see that?
Yes, I can see that.
Yeah. Um, okay. Evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's session that I've called "Black Lives in the Sticks: Caribbean Northants and Decentring Black London in the Film and TV Industry, 1948 to 1985." And really is exploring one of the reasons why I decided to do a PhD on Northamptonshire's post-war Caribbean history. This also comes from an earlier paper I did for a conference at Kingston University about experimental archiving practices. Um, and basically, this is the blown up version of the paper I did, which was about 10, 15 minutes or so. Um, and also, I have a book chapter coming out in May of the same title as well. So basically, what you're getting is um, the presentation version of a book chapter that I've got coming in the next couple of months or so. And really how mainstream knowledge making of Black Britishness seems to revolve around Blackness in London and other major cities, where those experiences are treated really as the only experiences, excluding wider provincial Black Britain, including Northamptonshire, and what we were doing between 1948 and 85. Representations of Blackness, historically and in contemporary, are dominated by major cities, but particularly cities within England in particular. Um, for those of you who are not from Northampton, Northampton is a town in Northamptonshire, a county in the Midlands, within the country of England, about an hour from London to the south, and Birmingham, an hour from Birmingham to the north. And this paper takes film and TV depictions of post-war Black Caribbean London and puts them, I guess, opposite or adjacent to what was going on in Northampton and a bit in Wellingborough as well in those years between 1948 and 1985. Um, just a bit about me as well. So my name is Trey Bentel Griffiths, and I'm a UK Northampton-based creative and scholar whose work can be broadly contained within UK Black history, neurodiversity, the arts, cultural criticism, and insurgent politics. And I've written on quite and spoken on quite a lot of different types of things, from the UK Empire honours system to things like autism and intersectionality, or even down to how film and television can help us make sense of complex academic theories and ideas. For context, my research is a creative writing PhD, not a history one. My working title is Northamptonshire is the place for me. Creative responses to provincial England's Caribbean diaspora, 1948 to 1985. And I'm using oral history testimonies, limited secondary sources like history books, for example, and other sources like news media at the time to produce a piece of creative non-fiction for my PhD, which basically are true stories with a literary flair. During my interviews, I have found numbers of people who came from the Caribbean in the 50s and 60s, either as adults or as children, saying as well that they're not Windrush because that was the name of one ship. Yet what was one ship arriving into Tilbury docks in June 1948 has come to be a term imposed in many different ways on a generation of people who never intended to make history, but were just trying to live. So my great grandparents and my grandparents' generation were not the first Black community in this country either. They followed numbers of black people who were here between the First World War and the Second World War, and prior as well with black Victorians and the black Georgians before them. But the original ship that has come to be synonymous with black Caribbean so-called uh, first arrivals, the Empire Windrush, was owned and operated by a German 1930s company line called the Hamburg Sud under Monte Rosa. During the war, it was a German Navy troop ship, and then after that, it was taken by the British government and renamed Empire Windrush. However, the term Windrush generation was coined by a Jamaican former RAF pilot called Sam King to mean people like himself who came between 1948 and the early 70s. Um, the post-war Caribbean narrative that the media co-opted in the term Windrush then in publishing and with film and TV has long been a story told about major English cities, but really dominated by London, London. Um, Other cities may include Bristol and Birmingham, with the addition of Liverpool as well, if you're lucky, and maybe Manchester and Leeds in the north. Yet, my family, like many, holds no such history as mine has been in Northampton since the early 1960s. My family came to Northampton in 1962. My mum's families, the Bentals, the Noels, the Baptistes, and the Cadors in Northampton all came from Grenada. Specifically, my maternal great grandparents, Torley and Edison Noel, were in Northampton by 1962. My grandfather's mother, Sita Vental, however, never left Grenada. She lived in a place called Grandroy, but came to Grandroy from somewhere else called Trouillot. And she was a market trader. My grandfather is one of 11 siblings, and his brother Albert was the first to come, came to England in 55. And both my grandfather and my auntie Kay remember that, and they told me so in interviews, because it was the same year as a very nasty storm called Hurricane Janet as well. Auntie Rosie, pictured in the bottom left-hand corner as well, below, was in Northampton from the early 60s and worked as an auxiliary nurse within the NHS, as many local black women did. But my auntie Kay didn't come to England until 67 and settled in London. Their sister, Auntie Bet, as well, also settled in London. And Uncle Albert didn't come to Northampton until I think it was 1967, 68, after working for many years on the London buses. And he came to be known as in Northampton as Wiseman, and worked at British Telecom, so BT. Uncle Albert's, Auntie Bet, Auntie Kay, Auntie Rosie, and my grandfather came from a family whose background was in farming, and everything they ate came from the land. And back in the village, everyone knew each other's business. So when they got here, Grenadians in Northampton found each other as they did in London. So for many that came from the rural areas of the Caribbean and settled in big cities, must have been quite disorientating, which may have made towns like Northampton and Wellingborough appealing, possibly reminding them like a bit of home in a way. And focusing on the big cities, I think there was a forgotten or unremembered rural heritage of those early Caribbean arrivals at risk of being lost. Yet my project is also what we call auto ethnographic. So ethnography is the study of culture, and auto is focusing on the self, so the I, the first person. So auto ethnography basically means how personal experiences can inform cultural experiences and how we make sense of the world and our place within the world as well. Well, people like Louisa Adjoa Parker have written about African American GIs in 1950s Dorset, or Cameron Kebleroy and Peter Aspinall on mixedness in the long 20th century, and even historians of the Black Tudors that talk about Black people in the provincial areas. In the UK, we do not have a breadth of scholarship that tracks the Black presence in provincial England or Britain. Many books we do receive are about Black people in major British cities like London. David Olusoga's book, Black and British, tracks a Black British history, including on American and including the British history that happened outside of Britain, on the American and the African continents. But most of the bits that are focused on Britain are focused on big English megacities. There are bits about the rural Welsh countryside with the GIs and the brown babies, the children they had with local white women. And there's also bits about Afro-Roman military units out in Cumbria. However, it's a drop in the ocean of a very big pool of water, and Scotland really doesn't get a look in at all when it comes to discussions of this nature, let alone Northern Ireland. Hakim Adi, as well, his book, African American People in Britain, A History, also is really a history of Black people in England that focuses on the cities. When towns and villages are mentioned, they are afterthoughts or footnotes and pushed to the margins. Similarly, I found Miranda Kaufman's Black Tudors a compelling read, but also one where towns and villages are not really explored that much. Gretchen Gerzina's also Black England, a forgotten Georgian history, is really a story about the Black Georgians in London. And Peter Fryer's landmark Staying Power also spends much of the time focused on cities and treats provincial Britain, so Britain outside of major cities, as an add-on to the city picture frame. Likewise, books that have been suggested to me by other people, by authors like Kennetta Perry, for example, Kieran Connell, Stuart Hall, David Matthews, Rob Waters, Paul Gilroy, and Colin Grant about the Windrush and the post-Windrush narrative are not really about Black Caribbean people in the context of Britain's towns and villages, but the city. In fact, in lots of what has been suggested to me as celebrated work, these aren't stories relatable to me or my family, and many of the folk people I know who have told me stories about Black people in places like Gloucester, for example, Aylesbury, Bedford, Blackpool, Leicester, and further north in the north of England. And even also my good friend Yasmin Begum's work, based out in Cardiff as well. She's always talking about Black people in Wales. A lot of what has been produced as universal is really centered on cities, but really cities within England, and really most of the time London. So likewise in fiction, from things like To Sail with Love, all the way to Lone Londoners, to Andrea Levy's book Small Island. These are books I love, but are really evident of the fact that, say, post-war Caribbean Britain is not universal, let alone the stories of Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. In an American context, legal scholar Nancy Wilson tweeted about similar issues, saying, when I finish this book, I'm going to write a book about rural Midwestern Black folks, so states like Nebraska, Minnesota, and places like that in the States. Too much Black studies assumes we are either Southern or urban people, near or at the heart of megacities. Life in the great expanse of the Black Midwest is different, and that's why you have Langston and Tony, and he's talking about poet Langston Hughes there, and the novelist Toni Morrison, inspired by Black in the Middle by Terry and Williamson, and South to America, my sister auntie Imani Perry. Life in Middle England and other provincial areas is totally different to our megacities, from Stroud and the Five Valleys in Gloucestershire to coastal places like Hastings and Southend. What about Windermere and Keswick in Cumbria, Leamington Spa and Banbury in the Midlands, Newport, Swansea and Barry Island in Wales, and Sussex, so places like Rye and Crawley and Falmer and Brighton City. What about Grimsby, Bamber Bridge, West Hartlepool, Wigan, Scarborough, Morecambe Bay and Doncaster in the north of England, or Ennis or Cork or Newry or Fermoy in Ireland? And what about the areas of London that aren't Brixton or Notting Hill or Shepherd's Bush, like Acton, Edgware or Leytonstone or Croydon, or even where my university is, Kingston-on-Thames? What would a Black Caribbean history of Surbiton look like? A project on Northamptonshire, in fact, is a metaphor of what is possible in other places, English towns, villages, minor cities, and general cities, towns, and villages of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. At least in part, I plot this talk from literary critic Corinne Fowler's The Green and Pleasant Land, where he talks about the ideas of close-knit rural communities as key to the concept of rural idealism. She continued to say that communities, no less when dubbed rural, are a motive that include mutually beneficial human relationships, voluntary labour, investment in local affairs, neighbourliness. The neighbour is therefore a potent figure of belonging. This concept of a rural community connected with a collective nostalgia for rural places, which exist as outside of multiracial Britain. So in that idea, I I get you all to think about TV shows that you've seen. So think about things like Midsummer Murders, Father Brown, those very rural crime dramas where nothing ever bad happens. But clearly, these villages are probably the most dangerous in England because someone is being killed every week. These are the sorts of places that Colin Farrell is talking about in this context. Um, in the 50s and 60s, for example, Black American airmen could be found in fights with Northampton police, allegedly outside the Criterion pub, which was once found on Bradshaw Street. So that's now the Boston in Northampton. So that area of Northampton between the bus station and the Boston gay bar in Northampton. Much like the cities, Northants has its own post-war Caribbean narrative, simply most of the country is rural. Maybe due to that provincialness, relationships with the police in those days differed from those in the cities or inner city London. At least that's what I was told by local people during interviews, juxtaposed not only to the brutality of London Met, who are famously violent today and 15, 60 years ago as well, but also screen iterations of policing Black London through films like Babylon, and things like Small Axe as well. Hazel Carby's book Imperial Intimacies tells her story as a child of a Black Jamaican man and a white Welsh woman, born as one of the many mixed heritage children after the Second World War, adjacent to the estimated 2,000, what the US press dubbed as the brown babies. So these were the children of the Black GIs and white British women that were born in that period as well. Likewise, local woman Barbara Nelson, the child of Jamaican Winston Nelson, and an English woman, Phyllis Turner, told me about her experiences growing up on Boughton Green Road during the 1950s and 60s. Hazel and Barbara's stories are similar. One born in rural Wales, 1948, while the other in Northampton, 1952. These stories weave into empire like my own work and chart my own trajectory through Northants, starting from 1962 with the arrival of my family from Grenada. At that time was also a British colony as well, gained its independence until 1974. Yet through many of these interviews with local people, Paul Gilroy's 1987 assertion of there ain't no black in the Union Jack has really come to speak to me in the sense that although many of my participants came here as children or born in this country, there still was a feeling of unbelonging and otherness. His 1991 critique, "It ain't where you're from, it's where you're at," couldn't be more relevant in 2024. As a Black person with a UK passport today, I probably would never identify as British, but I'll be more likely to claim a Northamptonian identity. So I would relate more to the town that I'd grown up in rather than the country. Here, so-called Black British media have largely enforced historical ideas of Black people in megacities as representations of Windrush narrative, showing how city narratives become an archive where history is produced and naturalized, much to the exclusion of non-city Black experiences. So the city has become a canon of its own within the official history of the Windrush, so to speak. But there are other types of stories. My cousin Weeks told me that in comparison to Northampton, growing up in rural Grenada was a very challenging time. He says, as a family, we never had a fridge. As a family, we never had a cooker. Everything was organic. So the sea provided the fish and the land provided the food. It was a case of no one got on the bus and went to Sainsbury's and got a trolley and got stuff off the shelves. It was us going to the field, the allotment, the bush, call it whatever you want to call it, and we just took what was provided, whether it was banana, sweet potato, yam, plantain, you name it, it was there. We came home, prepared it, and we ate it. Things like chicken was killed and prepared, fish was netted and prepared. I'm saying challenging because I'm comparing it to England. As a kid growing up in Northampton, these are things we would never have done, bearing in mind we never had electricity, so everything we ate was with a kerosene lamp. But if you lived there, it would have been normal. The rural Caribbean has another context. Provincial Northants has another context. Cultural texts like Steve McQueen's Small Axe and Andrew Levy's Small Island follow in the footsteps of other works that they don't really explore the the people that came from the countryside. And that's films like Babylon as well. It focuses on the city. Burning an Illusion, it's the city. Young Soul Rebels, it's the city. And it comes attached to books like Lonely Londoners as well. To Sour with Love, set in East London, and many others. Modern day films and TV dramas about Black people are two narratives that tether Black identities with the city. Most recent one I've heard about is a show called Borders, about these kids from London who go to a private school, which is out in the rural, but these kids are from inner city London, these Black kids. So it really comes back to London and very London-centric narratives of what Blackness is on television. Um, Furthermore, films like Rocks, set in London, problematize Black and brown children when they find themselves in the coastal village of Hastings, um, and forced to promptly return back to London where they so-called belong. To think of the screen as a site of historical production where public perceptions of Windrush and otherwise Black British Caribbean communities are produced, the onus on London and other cities effectively tells us there is a subliminal city thinking maintained by the white-owned media and white-owned publishing. There is a whole canon of popular Black British television that talks about London as if it is the centre of the universe. In that sense, everything from the BBC's May I Destroy You to the recent series Dreaming Whilst Black. This arrived in addition to the more historically broadly described Windrush era history itself. For myself, my family, and many of the people I grew up with, lots of these texts described as cornerstones of representation may not be directly appropriate for us, not because of Blackness, but because of geography as well. With much of our Black experiences being outside of the major cities as well. If you've grown up in somewhere like Bedford or Northampton or Leicester, as a Black person, what could you possibly have in common with the Black folks that have grown up in, say, somewhere like Brixton? And there are different, there are many nuances that change depending on where you've grown up. Similarly, the north of England, your references will be different as well. When I tell people that my family came to Northampton in '62, many are confused. Towns like Northampton and Wellingborough have had Black Caribbean communities since the earliest days of the 50s, concurrent to big cities as points of major settlement in England. Black British films and TV programs about Black people across time periods remain fixated on cities, but really London. So rural crime shows like the BBC's Murder is Easy, based off the Agatha Christie book, showed me the possibilities of period dramas made unsettled, what Corinne Fowler called the green unpleasant land. And that program did more for me in 2 hours than Three Little Birds or even Small Axe, showing the potential of Black leads in period dramas set in the post-war era where racism, or racialization, I should say, isn't the primary focus. Despite that miniseries following a Black Nigerian guy in rural England in 1954, I saw scope for doing the same in other places that may want to talk about a Caribbean presence over a Caribbean community. During the same years, Small Axe is set, Northants had a thriving Caribbean community. Small Axe was an anthology series about race relations in 70s and 80s London. And that same era had regional housing developments where large movements of people relocated from the cities to provincial areas of the Midlands. This is what led to the building of housing estates like Hemingwell in Wellingborough, and the Arbours in Northampton, whose existence did not come also without challenge, and also in some cases discontent from local people, who in many ways, kind of like villagers, saw their neighbourhoods as guarded sites of belonging. Many of those who came from London had Northampton and Wellingborough sold to them as new towns that were cheaper to live in and were every bit London's match as far as high street shopping experiences, a history that has been lost due to mainstream city preoccupations. And there's a lot of news articles to that avail in the archives as well, saying about London is coming, is going to ruin everything, and very much in the idea of a big village in that sense. Lots of novels written to talk about experiences of Caribbean parents and grandparents are part of a canon of great yet limited writing, writing that has been positioned by the UK publishing as representative of all post-war experiences. So likewise, on the big and small screen, films like Pressure which was the first Black British feature film, I guess, to get theatrical release in '76 by Horace, through to Babylon and Burning Illusion. Black British films almost exclusively treat London as if it's the centre of all Black British experiences. Other texts include Desmond, which I think you can now watch it on Netflix now, Young Soul Rebels, and also the Real McCoy, giving rise to films like the Kidulthood Trilogy, Belle, Rocks, and most recently Rye Lane, I think, which just won a BAFTA award, I think, recently as well. Northamptonshire, the site of my research, has an adjacent history going back to 1948 when Winston Nelson, a demobilised Jamaican RAF pilot, came to Northampton. Similarly, people like Joyce Martin from Jamaica were here from the 1960s. Warwick Graves Andy from Guyana was here in '56. He told me about others who were here around the same time. Furthermore, Merle Ingram from Jamaica came to Northampton in 1958. At one point, housed with a Polish family on St. John Street, which is now gone, but was near the Derngate. Nonetheless, those with executive power in TV and film continue to centralise London as really the only site of where history of our Caribbean, post-war Caribbean history is being produced. As much as it is in publications. We may begin to understand firstly why I'm met with shock when I tell people our post-war history, especially when we think of stories of policing on screen, as if there's one definitive story of policing. More so when we can think about individual decisions over institutions and policy making. So Northamptonshire Police, for example, have always been, let's say, much to be desired, pertinently in the eyes of young Black people. But there are stories of individuals who, let's say, went rogue or went against the grain and made choices that put community ahead of the policing institution. If Northamptonshire isn't without racist policing, there was a parallel culture of community policing that differs from the mainstream knowledge of Brixton and Handsworth as well. For example, during the '70s, Persuaders Youth Club on Clare Street, where Northamptonshire Music and Performing Arts Trust now is, used to field a youth cricket team that played local police officers. This was run by Leo Walker, originally from Nevis, alongside Joyce Eubanks and Beverly Chisholm, both Caribbean, but I'm not sure which island they were from. Originally, an officer called Mick acquired a cricket kit for the young people, and that was really an act of kindness from a lone police officer, which he didn't have to do, but he did, which helped foster relationships between some Black youth and police, and they had annual cricket matches for quite a while, and it helped break down many barriers that have come back today. When we begin to think about personal storytelling as a form of activism, this also means thinking about minoritized groups as diverse and not monolith. The stories of Black people in London are by no means interesting, but also not ones I personally relate to, having grown up in Middle England. So I think I have more in common with things happening in Northampton and Wellingborough. I live in places like Leamington Spa, and those sorts of very much Middle English England, like Midsummer Murder type places than I would say Brixton or Notting Hill, etc., etc. This begins to show me how that intersections exist within intersections. So, i.e., Black countryside history is a niche within an already established niche of Black British history. Nadine White's film, The Barrel Children, pictured there, about the children that were left behind in the Caribbean by Windrush parents who came in the '60s, also symbolizes the numbers of niches that exist within a Black British narrative. So the Windrush history is on one side, but what they did when they came here, but also what did the children do back in the Caribbean, those who were left behind. Similarly, the story of Joyce Martin and what led her to making her name as a trailblazer in Black hairstyling deserves its own session. This is a Northampton history of Black hairstyling, which sits in a broader context of not only Black hairstyling in the UK, but one with links to the United States and the wider natural hair movement, where Black hair is never just hair. The stories we have received about adjustments to, or cultural adjustments in the big cities, seems to go as far as looking at moving from one country to another, falls short of thinking about the adjustments that might have been made for people that moved from the countryside or the Caribbean countryside into English busy megacities. When my great grandfather Denmark left Grenada in 1960, he left behind a very countryside rural life. His daughters, my grandmother and my auntie told me that they came from a farming community, sustaining themselves on natural produce that made from the land. Similarly, as I said earlier, my cousin Weeks, who came to Northampton in 1968, reminisced to me about the upbringing he had without a television in their home, only to get to England and become obsessed with films and cinema later on as well. For many people who came from the more rural areas of the Caribbean, only to be thrust into big cities, there was a rural heritage within those stories at risk of being lost. So that alienating city life could be possibly one of the reasons why my grandmother's auntie, Dina Cador, Dina Noel originally, and my uncle John Cador came to Northampton from London. Likewise, my granddad, Ben Mark, started in London, as did my grandfather Sarge and his brother, my uncle Albert. Ben Mark came from a farming background and then worked at Phipps Brewery in Northampton for many years, while great grandma Tylee worked at M1 Cafe as well. During the late 60s, she also worked at St Andrews and St Crispin's on the psychiatric wards as a cleaner, and was victim to some of the worst racism that's become synonymous with the National Health Service as well. In today's language of misogynoir, she was overworked and underpaid for being a black woman. My mother also remembers her grandmother defending herself from racist white people on Northampton buses, whilst Northants did not have the kinds of uprisings seen in many big cities. My home county is a site of historical production. There are nuances that articulate a black experience of provincial England that decenters those usual city landscapes as well. What Trouillot's father says about historical production, we are all amateur historians with various degrees of awareness about our production, learning history from similar amateurs. Universities and university presses are not the only producer of that historical narrative. Most Europeans and North Americans learn that history through media that have not been subjected to the standards set by higher education. Long before non-academics read the historians who set the standards, the colleagues and students, they access that history through celebrations, site and museum visits, movies, national holidays, and primary school books. So here I think about how I first learned history, and it was through films. So when I was growing up, I watched things with my grandmother, like The King and I, and those sorts of films. And then it was only later when I went to university that I picked up academic books and textbooks and things like that. Similarly, in the US context, celebrations like Thanksgiving, as problematic as it is, that might be a person's first introduction to the history of genocide of the indigenous American people. And then only later on, you might begin to pick up history books about that too. Site and museum visits, again, as growing up in the Midlands, I went to Warwick Castle quite a lot when I was a young child. I know kids today will go to places like Delapre Abbey and places like that too in Northampton. So following Trouillot's articulation, we might observe that history which swathes of the public, or the UK public has consumed, about Black Caribbean lives from the screen is one of big cities. My auntie Dina, who I mentioned earlier, just like many of her Caribbean Londoner counterparts, also ran blues parties like the ones we saw in Small Axe, and she was one of many Black Caribbean people living locally to Northampton in the 60s that loved to have a good time and party, and she ran basement parties from her house on Vernon Terrace. Black communities in Northampton and Wellingborough have curated parties in their own homes because many local clubs did not want Black customers. In Northampton, many of the pubs on Wellingborough Road practiced colour bars, which created a need for the local Black community to make our own fun, as my grandfather told me. They made their own fun due to racism, in some cases charging for entry, further for food and drinks. Someone would normally cook something like curry goat, curry chicken, plantain, rice and peas, and so on, patties. Across the country, these parties were criminalised by the police. In Wellingborough, some of the early parties occurred at the co-ops from Oxford Street and Cannon Street in the town centre. The Gloucester pub on Church Street also had Shibby, with Rock Community Centre as well, which was home to Wellingborough's youth provision, also held blues in the 70s. That building is now Wellingborough African Caribbean Association, otherwise known as WACA, and which has been there as that since 1980. But I know the organisation was prior on Harriet's Lane, but the process of the move I've yet to investigate. But I'm sure people who are watching today, who were around at the time, might be able to enlighten people on that, and me especially. So from the early 60s, ska had reached Northampton, and there were ska parties as well in the Mounts, which later morphed into reggae parties. One of my elder aunties told me that during the 60s she would dance the night away every weekend. And at these parties, you may have heard the sounds of the Scartalites, Prince Buster, Toots and Maytals, Millie Small, Desmond Decker, and others. Some neighbours complained to the police, leading to raids. Often police would tell partiers to just turn the music down. And my grandfather said some officers could be reasoned with and won over by drinks or food, and sometimes they would join in the party. So that would also happen. These parties in Northamptonshire were in places that were in closer proximity to the rural rather than to big urban settlements. Furthermore, there were fewer cars on the road back then than those who came to Northamptonshire as children in the 50s and 60s and or grew up locally in that area into the 70s. Talk to me about how they would go to youth clubs, they would go scrumping and just eat sweeties that were bad for their teeth and go on long bike rides. Those descriptions to me reminded me of the Kids on Bikes genre of storytelling. So those sorts of films like The Goonies, like Close Encounters, like Stand By Me, and even more recently, things like Stranger Things on Netflix too. Nikki Taylor told me young people now know lots about the world but have little freedom in it, and that has really stuck with me ever since I talked to her. And it exists juxtaposed to the experiences of Black children in the 50s and 60s and the early 70s in Northamptonshire. Descriptions of childhood from Black people who grew up in the area during those years appear no different to the texturally white palette of 1980s young adult adventure films. In many ways, their descriptions speak against the assumptions modern audiences have made about Black experiences of those who lived outside of the cities. The way people my age, in my experience, have talked to me and punched down on the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. I find it quite dismissive of the fact that they're still fighting a lot of the same problems, particularly on the grounds of discrimination and racism and violence. At the same time, some of my generation talk to me about modern times, in air quotes, as a more enlightened period because it is not old. And I find that quite challenging to listen to. In the early days, Abington was where many of Northampton's Black Caribbean community lived. And because of this, it was much harder for white racism to present itself without being challenged, especially among young people. By the 80s, social youth groups were increasingly mixed, and racism was not tolerated in many ways. And in many schools, anybody caught doing it got beaten up. So racism was pervasive in Northamptonshire, no doubt about that, but it was not free from consequence. Yet for many Black people who were not in Abington or in the town centre, life was much harder. So areas like Dustin, Kingsthorpe, Delapre, and Far Cotton were described to me as areas where Black people were fewer in number and less protected, while white racism was empowered. Going to Delapre School in the late 60s, June Elizabeth White-Smith Gully describes being chased through Far Cotton Recreational Ground, a park known as Far Cotton Rec, by a mob of white boys chanting the N-word. Living in Northampton area during the late 40s, Phyllis Turner, so that's Barbara Nelson's mum, was spat at by white people for having children with a Black man. A Black mixed heritage woman I spoke to also recalls her own mother telling her about being sent to a reform home by her own father for being wayward and uncontrollable. Her father just didn't like the idea of her dating Black men. Similarly, Mary Clark told me as a Black mixed heritage child in the late 60s, early 70s, and recalls at 4 years old being chased through Kingsthorpe by white children holding such shiny objects, probably knives. Her mother, Pat Heasman, has had stones thrown at her by white people while pushing Mary's brother, her son, in a pushchair. So the stories of racism I've been told across over 100 odd interviews range from being infantilized to being infirmed, yet many who grew up between 55 and 75 recall having wonderful childhoods. The racism they experienced was mainly tolerable due to the unofficial solidarity networks. And for lots of them, they say racism is worse today than it was then. because there's less community today in the face of it. And that fighting spirit that manifested in the school playgrounds and in local pubs in some cases has evaporated and been domesticated out of us as well. So terms like rural usually conjure up images of diddly chapels, rolling hills, bowls, cricket, pubs, fetes, cows, sheep, and local chasing outsiders with pitchforks. Going to schools in the sticks, as I did, my early school days were more like the whiteness of those Edwardian children's novels, like The Railway Children, than the multiracial aesthetics of films like Rocks or Rye Lane, and even more recent things like Top Boy as well. Although some may argue towns like Northampton and Wellingborough are not rural in the usual sense, Londoners in those days did think of this area as country. Many of the housing estates that we now have were fields at one point. Areas like Lings, Stan's Barn, the Arbours, and others which expanded Northampton to the east were built to cater for those problematically described as London overspill, many of whom moved up for jobs and cheaper housing. In the 70s, there was lots of discontent from Northamptonians to Londoners coming to live here that could be compared to a village in some aspects. Many locals saw Londoners as an infringement on their way of life. Northampton was a town, but its mentality was so rural, like a bad parody of an English village. And these pictures on the slides of Wellingborough in the late 60s, 70s, are images I took from a Facebook group called Wellingborough Now and Then. On Facebook, there are lots of these sorts of pictures which truly act as an archive of memories, nostalgia, and public history. And also probably unknowing to many of the people that find this stuff, doing wonders for people's mental health. These groups are priceless, with comment threads of individuals discussing what they remember from this era. But there are also lots of things going back to Northampton and Wellingborough in the 19th century as well, where even up to the 60s, these places were towns, but really big villages in concept. Between the 1950 and the early 70s, if someone new came to Northampton, there'll be questions like, who are you? Where do you come from? Where are you from? Who's your family? Those sorts of things. Newcomers were met with curiosity and suspicion, whether from overseas or from another city or from another town. And that's why I find myself more in tune with these sorts of village type period dramas, small town shows, a lot more than films made about Black Caribbean folks living in London. As a child, I would visit many of my school friends at their homes, and they lived in places like Horton, Gayton, Castle Ashby, very much these provincial Northamptonshire villages as well. The existence of groups like Black Girls Hike and Stroud Against Racism remind us of the racism inherent in who is also allowed to belong in the countryside as well. Black hikers and pub goers, for example, in these spaces are still seen as outsiders. When I've discussed my experiences of growing up and going on long walks in Brixworth Country Park, my Black colleagues who grew up in inner city London are sometimes aghast in disbelief, and this became more apparent during my undergraduate degree when I talked to many students from North and South London who couldn't believe that I'd grown up in Northampton, as many of my friends had done as well. Let alone childhood nature walks and camping that was completely normal to my family's way of life. Yet in hindsight, I can say my family were always the only Black family in these environments as well. Okay. For Black, one of my participants, a Jamaican who moved to South London as a child, moved from South London as a child from Jamaica, encountered this very much this difference of this othering, this geographical othering, but also racial othering, when she moved to the Northamptonshire village of Beaujeu in 1980, and was the only Black woman in the village for a long time. Living in Beaujeu, she used to have to Northampton and Wellingborough or London for any Black cultural stuff like events, foods, and hair appointments, and she was frequently going back to the capital. Many did not. In fact, many young people made their own fun as a form of DIY activism. For Black youth in Northampton, Mata Fancanta on Sheep Street was a unifying force, a self-organised space that provided activities and professional development opportunities. It was an alternative to local youth service, which was not functioning effectively to cater to cultural needs of local black youth. In 1975, a group of black men drove from Knightsbridge and London to the Gambia on the African continent. One of these men was Lee Bryant, who had come to London as a child from Jamaica in '59, moving to Southampton in the early '70s as a motivated and inspired young adult. In the Gambia, he was inspired by young black people on a beach, none of them older than 18, but they were running a community centre. His experiences changed his perceptions of what responsibility can look like as well. So if they could run a centre as children, why couldn't black youngsters do it in Northampton? And that is in part what led to the formation of movement, as it was known, or MFM, developed through many conversations in people's houses. For example, on his return, Lee's house in the Lumber Tubs area, and then Palmerston Road was filled with people for weeks wanting to know about Africa and the trip. And it was suggested by a black American guy called Julian, they could squat a place, and they did. In '77, black Caribbean youngsters conducted a 48-day squat of the old Salvation Army Citadel on Sheep Street in the town centre. People like Lee Bryant, Trevor Hall, Pedro Samuel, Ira Moven, Job, and others were part of that original squatters crew. Job used to sleep there overnight while undercover police, disguised as homeless people, tried to coax him out under false pretenses. That first night, they did battle with the police, and really every night until the police stopped coming. What became known as MFM, or movement, was a self-managed space for youth activities and professional development, an alternative to local authority youth divisions. Before MFM opened, a white man called Tom ran a youth club called Steps on Kingswell Street, attended by many young white and black people. I was told he had also previously worked at the Roadbender Youth Club, which was, I'm told, was a racist youth club as well. In some cases, some of the youth workers there just didn't like black children going there, and some black kids who went there were treated that way as well. So, and he disagreed with some of the racism that was going on there and practiced against the young black people. When Steps folded, many that used it simply transitioned to MFM. And after the local establishment stopped threatening movement, they gave them some money in the form of grants to run classes in electronics and reprographic printing. A Jamaican called Herbert Mackenzie, who had trained in printing at Chronicle and Echo, ran the printing press. Movement printed all kinds of things, like magazines, but they also printed the brochures for the West Indian Parents Association. Electronics was run by a white guy called Phil, who taught electronics to many of the black guys for several years. And these professional development opportunities allowed young people to upskill themselves, many of whom had already been failed by local schools. And this was in the wake of the subnormal scandal of the late '60s, early '70s, when many black children were being dubbed by the state as educationally subnormal as well. With many MFM members being Rastafarian, they faced discrimination in employment and also from their parents, for their elder parents. This was compounded by racist schooling, illustrated in the work done by the West Indian Parent Association, founded in 1974. And before the founding of that organisation in '73, a white woman called Sarah Berry had come to Northampton to work at what was called Northampton Council for Community Relations. Her boss was a Grenadian called Bernard Gibbs, who was the Community Relations Officer. As part of the collective, she and others conducted a survey on black students' aspirations. The work they did led to the formation of that organisation in '74, including the convening of local Saturday schools. This followed the ESN scandal of the late '60s and early '70s, and many black children in Haringey were being called educationally subnormal. Similarly, able black children were being put into so-called, what was described in the time as so-called remedial classes in Northants, and viewed as educationally subnormal. In Northamptonshire, such schools, I'm told, included Weavers in Wellingborough and Billingbrook in Northampton. So the founding of MFM by many young Rastas was viewed as antagonistic to the state, namely policing and local authority, as well as the local black organisations, some of whom who saw Rastafarians as criminals and drug dealers, demonising them based on deep-rooted bias in I guess what we call respectability politics, for lack of a better term. These young people were victims of local police, further to private security in the newly built shopping complex, the Grosvenor Centre. In that era, police were already targeting black people, predominantly young men, had those actions greenlit by the state with the introduction of sus laws in the 1980s. Matter Vancanta has existed in a time where white supremacy pervaded mainstream employment practices and education and stunted Black progression. This organisation was a form of activism that inspired others, including Punjabi youths in Leicester who went on to squat the old Moat Boys School in around 1982-83 as an alternative to the local authority youth services and Asian organisations based around religion and dominated by older men. Movement was freedom from oppression, as many of their elder parents had arrived in England or Britain with colonial mindsets. Rastafari became identifiable with many youth experiences. MFM held many activities, like a magazine, like fashion shows, arts and crafts, film exhibits, sports teams, African dancing workshops, Rastafarian education, sound system, and Caribbean dances. And this centre became a point of engagement for many young people and a hub for any young person who wanted a piece of the action. Although cities like London have similar yet different Black Caribbean histories to counties like Northamptonshire, friends and colleagues in my community have told me or reminded me of the importance of this sort of localized research. It has brought them belonging. To see the place you have called home written and discussed with the same enthusiasm as broadcasters give London has brought them there, both to white and Black people. Nuances exist in many of the stories, including the relationship between Persuaders Youth Club and the police. In fact, when you go out into the provincial areas, the idea of a Caribbean presence over a Caribbean community becomes more visible. And though Northamptonshire did have Caribbean social clubs, Caribbean cricket teams, and even certain sections of Northampton and Wellingborough, at least, that were Caribbean communities, Abington and Northampton, and I'm told Queensway after a certain point in Wellingborough, these were places that did not exist in a void that also included Indian communities as well from the 60s and 70s too. For me, I find the term presence more helpful than community. In the 60s, there was an Indian guy in Northampton that everybody called Peter, which I do not think was his name, and he sold Caribbean food. There was an Irish woman called Mrs. Geddes who owned a shop that many Caribbean people used as well. If there is anything that separates Northamptonshire, then the current way London story is told, it's the lack of inclusion of cricket in London. Cricket to West Indians living in England in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was a way of life. No less than when the West Indies started to win so consistently, it impacted how Caribbean folks would walk down the street. Northampton had their own Caribbean team who were as good locally as the West Indies were internationally. Out in the Midlands, we are not short of cricket fields due to our proximity to the countryside, and the team, United Social, played many of our village teams as they did national club teams too, including in London, but also in Leeds, Huddersfield, and others. If you found a Caribbean community anywhere in England, the likelihood of finding a cricket club would be high. So you'd find that different communities across the UK would know each other through cricket. What we do not see in media representations is how many Caribbean communities were connected due to cricket or proximity to a club. Though cricket is played in London, it is seen as a countryside sport, but it was played widely in the Windrush era in this country and in the Caribbean. Representations of Black lives in the Stix are not in the popular mainstream, but they are there. Series 7, Father Brown, Guardian, Trinidadian butcher in Kembleford, a fictional village in the Gloucestershire Cotswolds during the 50s. Likewise, the Father Brown spin-off, the Sister Boniface Mysteries, is led by Sister Boniface, a nun that solves crimes, like her priest counterpart, Father Brown, and also a Black officer from Bermuda. Series 5 of Inspector Morse spin-off, Endeavour, also includes Windrush visibility in 1960s Oxfordshire, as does the Series 8 premiere. Though not Caribbean, the recent Agatha Christie adaptation of Murder is Easy has a Black Nigerian lead in a murder mystery set in a fictional village called Witchwood under Ash, presumably a fictionalisation of the Oxfordshire's Ascot under Witchwood. So cricket as a method of building community is not something that's been effectively explored on film or on TV, but it is a narrative that's very common when you begin to follow the trajectories of blackness outside of the major cities, even though the cities played it too. The focus on London by major broadcasters stops us from really exploring what other black communities were doing, further to other individual Caribbean characters and other black people that went and settled in very white places. As we know from the histories of the black American GIs that had children with white women during the Second World War, a lot of those mixed race children either ended up in care or growing up in very white, provincial white places. So when we begin to look outside of London's borders, even to minor cities, we begin to see blackness is very different to the mainstream. So my PhD tracks some of this in Northampton, where a mix between the town and the rural saw many black people doing things that in media have been attributed to white people. The types of freedoms black children had playing out on the streets of the 50s is quite like the depictions of childhood in districts of East London, like Poplar and called Midwife. Even though that program is set in London, it's almost like East London is other London. It's like London other. It's very quaint and unbuilt up, and everyone is nice to each other, much in the lens of what Corinne Fowler discusses as the green and pleasant land. Likewise, to have blues parties and sound system in Northamptonshire, as we did, runs juxtaposed to films like Babylon in the 80s, that saw sound system reggae culture as intimately connected with, I guess, urban geographies of London. In Northamptonshire, there would be reggae sound clashes with other local sounds. In Wellingborough as well, the way media and publishing have pushed London views of blackness as representative for everyone does not really work for me. We have other histories of provincial England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland that have similar and contradictory narratives worth talking about. Like the community I've grown up in Northampton, and going out into Wellingborough as well, have incredible stories going back decades that could well be put to screen. London has long been presented as the Black British knowledge centre, but maybe it's time to explore beyond that its borders into provincial England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. In mainstream representation about Black England, those cities do eclipse the narrative, notably London and other port cities like Bristol and Liverpool, or other geographies have been willfully ignored. Here, tales like that of my family history and others do trouble Britain's small island story and notions of Black London as universal. There are many Black British histories. All we need to do is look. And that's basically my PhD, and that's the underpinning of my PhD is I wasn't seeing enough of it on television, so I decided to research it for myself in short. But thanks very much for listening, and yeah, if anyone's got questions or anything, ask them. I think we're doing a Q&A in a minute. Androna, is that right?
Um, sure. I think that would be great.
Yeah.
Um, so just firstly, Trey, thank you so much for giving this little, I know this is only a small part of your
yeah.
PhD, but to pull together so much information, images, and testimony that is locally based is we're really pleased that you're being able to share that with us. So I'm just asking, so do you want to unshare, please, Trey, so that I can see more people, so we can see if anyone does want to raise any questions. Okay, I think you've stunned them all, Trey. Um, but yeah, I grew up on Lutterworth Road, which is quite close to your Abington kind of area. And certainly when I was at school, there was a big presence of children from the the Caribbean, of Caribbean origin. I remember that. And we're getting some stuff in the chat as well. I don't know whether you're seeing that, Trey. Okay. So with in the chat, looking forward to reading the final document, as always fascinating, relevant, and so well researched. And then also massive thank you for it, Trey. Thank you. Jenny, did you want to ask?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I don't know if I can add a little bit to the story of what you're saying about WACA, because I was working at WACA at the time on Heriots Lane, and I do remember the transition to Rock Street, and it was tough stuff. It was hard to get the building, hard to get the contracts, because they were always fighting against the perception of what it was going to turn into, the complaints before we'd even shifted in there. There was a transit. We had the both sites. So the Heriots Lane was the office base, and Rock Street was used for the venue for events, the socialising and so on. And indeed, those, when we shifted in there as a whole unit, there was forever complaints, real or not, because people were expecting it to go bad, and so would set us up to fail, if you like. And it was painful how we had to justify why we should exist. And it was a time when other communities were developing as well, where the Hindu association was growing, where mosques were growing, and it was actually an exciting time for usually unrepresented people. And because small organizations, small groups of people just had the audacity to do things for themselves, it was a challenge to community and local authority. And I believe it's still there till now.
Yeah, I think as well. In some aspects, we're still having to justify existing. I can't talk for like the sort of grassroots context, but in academia, it's pretty obvious that this is happening in academic context. In terms of what courses are being eradicated, so Hakim Adi, who I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, got made redundant from the University of Winchester, and he brought Britain's first African history degree, and that degree is gone. It's been taken out with him, and similarly Goldsmith's Black British Writing course as well, because there are people in academia that don't want students learning about Black British history, Black British culture, and things like that. So there's a lot of people. We've gone back 30 years in about 5 years when it comes to things like that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of justification having to be made about you're justifying your existence. And I think I'll come back to what Taylor Morrison said about racism, and she says that racism is distraction, and it stops you from doing your work. And I think that speaks to what you were saying about the origins of WACA and the complaints, but the non-complaints as well. The complaints are just there to distract you and keep you distracted and flapping, while the people who are racist are profiting from all the stuff, or getting all the stuff basically.
So just saying, we've got some more comments in the chat. April saying everything was hard, having to justify all what we did as a community. And then also we had Black diaspora theory at the University of East London, and that has gone out too. I mean, I don't want to, it isn't great to focus on too much on the negative, but it has to be said that there have been points in time where we had much better community infrastructure for Caribbean communities, particularly Black Caribbean communities in Wellingborough and Northampton than we do now. And I think that has to be said, and that also has been I would say quite a long process of dismantling. And it's also all the more important that we have sessions like this so that we can kind of remember and fight for more of those facilities, because they are needed. They are needed now more than ever.
I think part of the story is that the opportunities that people drove, like there was a Black History course at the university, it wasn't instilled, the university didn't own it, because as soon as the individuals who drove it moved on, left or whatever, the university just said, okay, that's it, that's our tick box.
And not to just highlight the university in this is with all the other institutions within Northamptonshire, local government in particular, but all of the other kind of schools establishments, and kind of through the academization, all of the support for investment into Black kids, all of that's just kind of become dissipated. Trey, it seems like we've kind of come to the end of questions. I don't know whether you've got any kind of closing or final comments, or whether you want to talk, just give us some more information about what happens from here on in terms of this piece of work and your PhD.
Well, my PhD it's not a history PhD, it's a creative writing one. So at the moment so basically a creative writing PhD is split into two sections. So there's the main discussion of the PhD is I think about 60,000 words. And that's where I write about the history of Northampton, Wellingborough, and the things I found out from people. But then there's the second part of it is about my own reflections on things. So that will come probably there with my family history in the town, for example. But also everything that you and Jenny were talking about will be going into there as well, in the sense that for Black people, brown people, like community work and things, there was a lot more openness back in the 70s and the 80s to do things than there is today, and that will go in the reflections bit of it. But also things about, say, for example, so Matter Van Canter, there was a lot of problems with Matter Van Canter towards the end. But the fact of the matter remains is that when it came down to it, the council brought in their bulldozers and took the building out literally at 3 o'clock in the morning. So there was no uprisings or anything, and that sort of thing would go into the reflections bit. But then last year, you'd go into the museum in Northampton, and you would see an exhibition, a punk exhibition that includes MFM. So it's sort of how institutions that were part of the problem in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s are now like, oh, I want to do Windrush. Let's do Windrush stuff. So there's a lot of that sort of thing going on. So that's what my PhD will probably look at, is that there's a lot of institutions locally with selective memories when it comes to things they did back in the day. And where I'm at with that now is on 15,000 words into the 80,000 word thesis, and hopefully I'll be finished by August or September. But what I need from people is give me photographs of things back in the day, photographs, any documents people can find about anything to do with Caribbean communities in Northamptonshire back then. news articles that you just not thrown away, anything like that is all of that is really helpful. But yeah, that's where I'm at with my PhD at the moment. And I'm currently researching chapter 4, which is about what I was saying earlier about childhood, and Black freedom in Northampton and Wellingborough, and the things kids used to do. So going out on bikes and stuff, going to explore the woods, and the sorts of sweets that people bought in the corner shops and stuff like that. It's that sort of stuff that's I find interesting as well. Because how much were the sweets? Because you go into a shop now, and I'm spending like 90p on a bar of chocolate, and then back then it was like 5p, and I'm like, there's that sort of stuff as well to think about. So
On Lutterworth Road, there was a shop called York's, and outside it there was a walnut whip machine, and I can't remember how much it was, but it was a single coin. And we've got another comment in the chat. Really looking forward to reading this. I can see parallels in what has happened in Leeds. So really
yeah,
resonating with you. And if I don't know whether you've got your contact details ready, but if not, if you contact Northamptonshire Rights Inequality Council, if you've got any of that stuff, we can forward it on to Trey. But Trey, if you want to give your contact details, that's also fine if you want to put them in the chat or whatever. So on that, I'm just going to say thank you so much, Trey. Thank you for everyone who attended to make this evening so special, and to try and listen. It was a really great evening, and at that we'll end the recording, and